Our topic this afternoon is dogs. Dogs in urban space. So first up, we should say we welcome all dogs, and if they have comments to make, we welcome those too, and we'll look to Alexandra to interpret them. I host a show about design and architecture. I've been many years in that world. And it's a world that very much likes to create space, create environments, create buildings, create cities. It doesn't always necessarily think too much about the humans that are going to be in those spaces, and probably even less about the animals that might make their way into those spaces. And yet, that community is very, very concerned with how our cities are forming. And how our cities are forming right now is that there is a surge of people moving back into our downtowns. Many of those people are actually single people or couples, and for whom a dog or a cat is really kind of an integral, essential companion to that household. But then what we're finding is that certain downtowns that are really amplifying to bring in people who want to have their pets are not necessarily accommodating to those dogs or cats. I think specifically of Los Angeles downtown, because I'm based in LA, which really underwent a dramatic overhaul, revival, initiated about 20 years ago. And as a whole bunch of buildings were converted, commercial buildings were adaptively reused and turned into lofts, initially the realtors trying to lease these spaces just found nobody was interested. People didn't want to move to downtown. It didn't have any appeal. And a guy in charge of leasing who had a dog and was crazy for his dog just sort of had this bright idea, let's say the dogs can come too. And overnight they got 300 people and 150 dogs moved into this environment. So it was a case of the tail wagging the dog, or the dog wagging the tail. Anyway, there was a tail and a dog in there somewhere. And downtown boomed, and since it's downtown LA, and since then now all the new buildings, the glossy towers, sort of rather similar to that one over there that are going up, they're all putting in dog runs, dog parks. You go to visit those buildings, the first person you meet is the dog walker, there's the dog beauty salon, and on it goes. And it's really been instructive in terms of signaling to people who are thinking about planning for downtown LA, like remember the dogs. So, but there's another question that also arises, which is, and what is life like in downtown LA for the dogs? There's hardly any green, despite the dog run. The dog runs are all astroturf. Do the dogs like the astroturf? Conversely, should planners be making more of an effort to make sure landlords allow people to have dogs? There's a whole bunch of questions surrounding the influx of humans plus dogs back into the urban centres, and that is going to be our topic today. I'm thrilled to see how many of you have got your dogs with you. So may I see actually a show of hands as to how many people have dogs in this area? So and I'm jealous of all of you, because I live in an apartment where we're not even allowed dogs. We're only allowed cats, and I'm a dog fancier. I wish I could have a dog. So I put myself in the percentage of people that itches to have a dog and isn't allowed to have one in the urban centre. So anyway, that's the start of our conversation. We have two fantastic people to talk about this. Howard Blackson, urban design and planning studio director, and he blogs vigorously about San Diego urban planning issues and had a role in the creation of Courtyard, which he's going to talk about. And then immediately to my left is really kind of the star of the show, actually, if I dare say that, Howard.
Say it.
Yeah, Alexandra Horowitz, who many of us may follow in the New York Times. She does the most fascinating op-eds relating to dog cognition and living with dogs. She's a professor at Barnard College at Columbia, where she heads the Dog Cognition Lab. She also teaches creative nonfiction writing and audio storytelling, and she's an alumna of UCSD.
That's right.
Author of several books on dogs and dog cognition and all of that. Most recently, Our Dogs, Ourselves, and Inside of a Dog. And she has 2 dogs and a cat, the dogs are called Finnegan and Upton,
Correct.
and the cat is called Edsel.
Yes.
Yeah, after the car.
Yes.
You think the cat is like an old broken...
My son did.
Anyway, so now we're going to throw it straight to you two. I think we have to start though with Howard, because we're having this conversation in Courtyard. It in a way encapsulates some of the themes that we're going to be addressing. So tell us about the genesis of Courtyard and the role of the dogs.
Courtyard was born from 4 or 5, maybe it was 5 original students who grouped together. Mike, was it your class or my class? Were that it was both classes, that's right. And we were showing them the students going through some of the tenets of the new urbanism, and so form-based codes and small town or traditional neighborhood development.
And we should just say that new urbanism is, in a way, trying to make places human-centered planning.
Human-scaled, that's
yes.
right. A human-scaled, a human-centered plan. And it's about 30-year-old movement that's gone through, it's a lifetime. And but one of the things that we did show them was the tactical urbanism. Tactical urbanism was an idea of doing a temporary or testing an idea on the ground before you actually invest all the money and time to do it. So you can do it a mixed use, which is what you see here. You've got coffee, you've got a bar, you've got a restaurant, you've got a stage, a performance stage, you've got a dog park, you've got office. This is mixed use right here. And this site was, the original site was over there. And so the students got together for their thesis, came up with a tactical urbanism project that would have been on where that building, that was on that building over there. I don't know if y'all remember a really bad mayor we had named Bob Filner, but Bob Filner used to have Saturday offices were open. And these students went to his office on a Saturday, showed him the plan, and he said, "That sounds great, I want it. Let's put it on our city property right over there." So the city had some land over there that they had control of, and he said, "Go for it." And these students and the people that now run the Rad Lab, that now run the Courtyard, try to do this all across the United States. I think they've got a project in Long Beach. I think they've got other projects across the United States. And they've created their own architectural business coming from an idea that came out of one of our classes. So it's a really interesting part. But the dog park was actually, in my opinion, Justin, where'd you go? Was the anchor for the other one. The food and the bar was on one end, and a much larger dog park was on the other end. And it was a more elaborate sort of dog area that you had to actually meet and engage with people. Now, coming here, they have a smaller space, and you can see the dog area is right here, actually. It's just now they've turned it into open seating. But the dogs were always a part of the Courtyard.
But there was an instinct that you needed the dog park.
Actually, the instant was the very beginning, because we had also worked on the City of San Diego's downtown plan was done 2011, I think it has passed. And they were really pushing for families. And in pushing for families, they had bonuses for 3-bedroom units throughout. They had children's parks. We've had several children's parks. And what happened was, and Pete Garcia, who's sitting over here, is the developer of Idea One. They have 250 units, and they have 250 dogs in the unit. People showed up with their dogs, but there was no dog parks at the time. And today there's still one and another in planning. But the need for the dog parks was actually from the very beginning, because everybody was walking around with no place to take the dogs.
What other dog-related activities, spaces have been factored into this neighborhood?
Mostly children's parks that the dogs all do their thing on. The park in the park, where the children's park area is where a lot of people walk their dogs, and they're not supposed to, but they do. And the children should wipe it down before the children play on it. the children's park that is over by the fountains, where Mike, you made the children's park, and you call it a children's park just so you can get funding. You didn't really care if the kids showed up, and it's mostly water feature, and there's not now the grass is there today, but that's not supposed to be a real dog park. Where's another dog facility? The Little Italy has what? The dog park. That's right. What? Balboa Park has the dog park, but that's a long haul. Fault Line Park is supposed to be a dog park too, right? It's supposed to be dog park during part of the day, which is right behind us. But that's really about it.
And these are sort of designated, circumscribed, perhaps in dog world slightly limited facilities, but they are facilities of sorts. So Alexandra, over to you. Do you let yourself live in New York City?
Yes, I do.
Yes,
right
so
in
you
Manhattan.
are living absolutely the urban Manhattan life with your 2 dogs and your cat. One, do you feel Manhattan works? And 2, when you hear what Howard has just laid out in terms of dog facilities, does it feel good to you? Would it be good enough for Finnegan and Upton?
Well, I think first of all, it's great that the urban planning is considering the humans, right? And then this extension of the humans, which are our furry humans, which most dog owners consider dogs their family members, right? Literally members of the family. And so it's a natural extension from providing opportunities and spaces that are designed for humans to providing opportunities for the rest of the family. And as we were just talking about a minute ago, it's not always obvious that those spaces are really designed with the qua dog in mind. In other words, they're designed as spaces where dogs can meet and go and relieve themselves, certainly, but not necessarily thinking about the range of dog-like things that a dog kind of needs to do. So it does satisfy some level, sounds like it satisfies some level of dog requirement, which is there's a space where they can meet other dogs potentially and interact with other dogs off leash and relieve themselves. But that's kind of it. I mean, they're very small spaces. People always used to ask me how difficult it was to live in Manhattan with 2. I have large dogs in an apartment, and it's the easiest thing ever because you're always out and in the parks. And what really happened was not that they created dog parks in New York City, but that they created hours where the parks are all off leash. So we have whatever it is, hundreds of acres of park. And that's just about enough to handle, the Upper West Side's dogs. I mean, you really do need a good amount of space for dogs to kind of be dogs, which is my interest.
Right. So are you saying that the dog parks are good, but they should be much better, that actually, if we're really going to viably make our downtowns really decent places for both humans and dogs to live, that actually we need to be thinking about bigger spaces, more generous spaces, perhaps with real grass, not astroturf?
Yeah, well, I am unreservedly dog-centered in my thinking. So if I could design it all for the dog, with the dog in mind, what I would imagine is thinking about what the dog needs or requires in the equation. So the person needs to take their dog out. So that's accounted for in a small park. But the dog needs to have a good amount of running around, needs to have opportunities to socialize with lots of different dogs and to get away from other dogs too, right? In a space like this, you can't get away, which is actually something that some dogs like to do. Their personal distance is different than our personal distance from each other. So 2 dogs that are 4 Labrador dogs worth away from each other could still be interacting. But those dogs are just on opposite sides of your space there, right? So yeah, they would need to be bigger. They would maybe need to have things that are stimulating for dogs, which would be, what's underfoot. Most dog parks are designed with cleanliness in mind, which is good, right? But they might be wood chips, or they might be gravel or astroturf. They would be opportunities for them to smell things, right? They're olfactory creatures. They live in an olfactory universe. And for the most part, cities, although, especially New York, the source of a lot of smells, are not the source of a lot of natural smells that the dogs are encouraged to interact with. And and opportunities to really play.
So, in your ideal dog world, would you work, say, with a landscape designer in the design of parks and really talk through the plants that dogs respond to, or the other creatures, or the plants that might attract the other creatures that the dogs respond to? Is there kind of a whole ecosystem that designers should be thinking about?
It's an interesting way to think about it, because it kind of mirrors what you do in a zoo design, right? What have we seen with zoo design in the last 40 years is a change from just kind of the space which fits the animal to a consideration of the natural environment for that animal and the requirements for that animal to be seen or not seen, to interact, to hide, to have stimulating things, different elevations. Now, dogs don't have a context outside of with us, right? There are stray dogs, they're free-ranging dogs, but there's no wild dog that is the domestic dog. So we don't exactly have that natural environment to model off of, but certainly we could look at their canid ancestors, right? Wolves and other canids, and see what do they need.
Well, that brings up a very sensitive topic, which is you've just mentioned sort of the feral dog, the wild dog. We as a society tend to kind of get rid of feral wild dogs, either through, I guess, killing them or spaying and neutering to make sure there's none that are born. So we have these lovely domesticated dogs that we sort of try and get them to conform to our will, and we've kind of ixnayed the feral population. Do you think sort of the domesticated dogs appreciate having more of its other members of the dog kingdom?
Well, the only feral dogs are really stray domestic dogs, right? So they're free-ranging dogs. They haven't turned wild again, really. They're just without owners and homes. But they do live in human societies, right? The reason that there are stray dogs in cities is because we are here, and we provision them, intentionally or not. Garbage provisions them, right? Just like all urban animals who live around us. So they are still living with humans, and they could be picked up, and that is what the shelter dog is a dog who is stray, and they're exactly the same as the dogs that we have in our homes. So yes, they would like the opportunity to interact with they are the same type of creature.
Got it. And I'm just looking over there and I see Justin. Justin runs Courtyard. And Justin we were sort of talking before our event started about the running of the dog park. And I'm hoping to, hand off the mic to Justin, because Justin brings up something very interesting relating to sort of, I guess, dog/human communication and kind of managing conflict in the somewhat confined space of a dog park. Can we just have him tell us what he deals with running the dog space, and then we go back to Alexandra?
I mean, just like dogs have personalities, humans have even weirder personalities. So when you bring an element like a dog that is pretty much, I have a dog, she's my family, she's my little girl. When you have that in an environment where they could have fun and play, but the owners are also there too. There was really no 10 commandments of responsibility, and we end up being either the police or the mediator for maybe two, three people that can't really figure out how to have a dialogue about what's right and what's wrong objectively for their dogs.
I mean, that's it.
And then on the emotional tip, it's very high tense, because you don't want any dogs to get hurt. On a object basis, a dog it's a thing. If you were to, like, if something were to happen, the way that it would work out is a dog is just it's a personal item, basically.
Property.
It's like worth $550 or something like that, which is not what I'm saying. Emotionally, it's priceless.
But what you're finding in your spot, in your dog park, is that you'll have humans that come with the dog. The dogs are very close to each other.
The whole space and vision is a social experiment. So the ability to have conversation and dialogue with the dog owners, real conversation as an owner, is it's invaluable. But with all the other elements of the way people express unhappiness, or when they are done wrong or their dog is done wrong, via Yelp or Google or basically everything aside from going by and having a conversation with the dog owner or the owner of the business. It creates a lot of challenges that could be, I think, remedied in a one-to-one conversation.
So Alexandra, what Justin has experienced is the dogs get into a conflict, and then the humans don't sort it out very well, and then put remarks on Yelp complaining. And what would your advice be to the sort of both the humans and the dogs?
So the social media complaint element is a new element, but the rest of it really recapitulates what dog parks have been like since they started, right? So what kind of happened historically is that there were no real leash laws until something like the 80s, and then a lot of municipalities instituted leash laws, and there had been dogs that would just be off leash or whatever owners chose. And then a few places experimented. Berkeley, I think, was the first with dog parks. As soon as you started having dog parks, you have dog park conflicts, and they're usually human conflicts, right? Because, as you say, I like the way you put it, just like dogs have personalities, we do too, right? Usually it's the other way around, but that's the point, is that we think the dogs can kind of sort it out. In a way, sometimes they can, but what we bring to it is also not factored into that small space environment. And that highlights this really unusual dog-human relationship that you're dealing with in the dog park, which is where we attribute a lot to our dogs, and we want our dogs to be reflective of ourselves. And so, and somehow, right, just the way that we get a dog that we like how they look, or some people get a dog because they're like a beautiful accessory item, or the status symbol, or they think they're sort of like, my dog's sort of athletic, and I'm kind of athletic, and so you want your dog to behave, or other people have ideas about how your dog should behave, and all of this comes out in a really weird way. It's all sort of unspoken until you're in a context like this tight little dog park with lots of dogs and lots of people, and then it comes out in this sometimes explosive way. So that has kind of always been the case, and I've never seen anybody properly manage it, because for one, there's no one right way to live with a dog, right? There's not just, I mean, I have opinions, but there's not one right way. I think they shouldn't really be like civilized humans, but many people do think they should be civilized humans, right? And polite with other dogs.
Except what's happening here is the humans are not being very civilized.
That's always the case.
Well, I think the challenge is first your perception of when you go to a dog park at Balboa Park or the beach at Ocean Beach, there is no policing factor. You're in nature. And I think we identified a problem with Courtyard is to activate unused space. So here we go, we're activating it. And then since there's commerce happening, there's a certain expectation that arises from dog owners because, I mean, it's totally free to always go to the dog park at Courtyard as a base. We don't make any money off of people bringing their dogs here, that transaction. But then there's I think a perceived need or service that people expect that's kind of the missing link.
Yeah, and that's what's new about you guys. So usually dog parks are monitored by members, basically, by people who go there. So there's no official monitor. They don't usually have security or staff who are being in charge of people's or dogs' behavior. So the difference, it sounds like, is that you are the umbrella organization, so they're looking to you to set all the rules and to enforce all the rules. Most places it's enforced by almost every dog park has like a person or persons who are like poop patrol, right? And like they go around like, your dog pooped, you didn't clean that up, your dog, if you're dog people, you know what I mean. Like there's always that person, and maybe it's you who does that, right? And that's self-imposed. There's somebody who feels like, if we're gonna have this space, we have to take care of it, and this is the way I'm gonna control it. But in a way, by having it in your space, they are all released of their kind of community responsibilities, and you're given the kind of parent responsibility.
Howard, I know you wanted to say something.
I was just thinking, have you ever read Mike Davis's work about Los Angeles,
yes.
City of Quarters?
Yeah.
And the way he talked about way we use signs, and we do tell each other where you are and who you are. And you just brought up the point of the dog as a status, the way when I grew up, a car was that status, it said who I was and make and model and all that. And it didn't, and it's gone now. That change has happened. Nobody uses cars for status anymore. but I do see dogs being used as a status. Could you? I don't know. I just think that was very interesting. And then one other point I'll just make. Also, I see it in thinking about dogs. There's an issue of scale, because when I was trying to ask you all where do we go, actually our dogs are car oriented. I have to go to an experience for Skittles, to experience nature. We go to Fiesta Island. Fiesta Island is a very big, and that's going through a major plan, and who's working on that that's here? It's just a mess. Yeah, you are. And it's an absolute, everybody's so crazy about how to deal with the dogs. Or we go to Ocean Beach. And so my dog becomes like the kids going to the football games or soccer games on the weekends. I have to put them in a car and take them to that off-leash place. And there really isn't, and I have one near my house, Grape Street, and the one that's in Balboa Park, there's no grass because San Diego is such a conservative town. Remember just 5 years ago, you really couldn't even eat outdoors, and then we finally let ourselves eat outdoors, and nobody died and nobody handed the kids the beer. Thank you for not doing that. And we didn't have outdoor dining for such a long time because we were so conservative. And now it's kind of, because of you, thank you, we're seeing the same thing with the dogs.
We're
true. Very conservative and policing and how are we going, and we're creating rules and laws and taboos right now that the next generation of design could take hold of, but it needs to be at the neighborhood scale, at the city scale, and at the regional scale. And we're not thinking in those terms right now.
And I'm going to add now the architectural scale. There's a lot of construction going on in downtown San Diego. There's a lot of construction going on in downtown LA. The downtown LA projects, I'm assuming the same is true here, are going to generally allow dogs. But are the apartments being designed for dogs? In LA, we've got a lot of all glass towers, for example. Some of them don't have decks. Obviously they don't have, natural plantings. There's a lot of, paint and all the materials that form a modern apartment. And we stick the dog in there and then maybe go out to work all day. And maybe I have colleagues, in fact, my engineer watches his dog on the phone. He's got a camera watching the dog back in his apartment. That dog is there for hours on its own. Is that a good life for a dog?
Right. Well, I mean, that really has to do as much with just our urban lifestyle as with architecture per se. We've created a lifestyle where we add dogs to our families and then don't make huge adjustments for them. Like the way we get dogs sometimes is very straightforward. Like by the end of this afternoon, we could have gotten more dogs. We could all adopted dogs, right, or bought dogs. It's easy to get a dog. And you don't have to have any training to get a dog, and you don't need to fulfill any requirements for the most part, except for at some shelters, which
sounds
have
like kids too, though.
But that's true. That's true. But if you don't maintain the well-being of your child, the government swoops in and takes the child from you. But if you then get your dog and put them in the apartment all day, and they get bored and eat all your stuff and bark, and your neighbors complain, then you try to train your dog, and what happens is people mostly relinquish their dogs if that happens. And we're allowed to give them up. So our lifestyle isn't quite dog-centered, which I understand, right? Like you can't organize your entire life around an animal, but maybe we should be organizing some of our life around this animal. I especially think so because this is an animal that gives us so much, and people who live with dogs get a huge amount of pleasure and good positive feedback, and they're always happy to see you. I mean, I relax visibly when I see dogs. I physically relax, right? My cortisol levels go down by petting a dog. We have like higher levels of oxytocin, and like we have positive effects from dealing with dogs. We've also made them come with us, right? We domesticated them. They were perfectly resourceful wolves out there doing their own thing. And we took them in and we molded them until they had no noses and can't really breathe. And like we provide them food twice a day in bowls. And now we're leaving them for 8 hours at home. It's like, whoa, like I think we should do a little more adjusting to sort of what they need. And I think we'd have better relationships for it. So that goes, I think, beyond architecture. But it would be amazing to imagine that what the human extended design of architecture included was the animals who we want to live in, who we brought into our fold.
just say you mentioned the dog molding and the flattened noses. You're referring to inbreeding to arrive at these sort of purebred specialized dogs. I think that's what you're referring to. But in terms of shaping our environments to be better suited to dogs, again, if you could work with the architect or the interior designer, what would you recommend? Are there materials that you'd say have more wood, have less plastic? I don't know what it is. Or do dogs like looking out of a giant floor to ceiling plate glass window, or do they not like it?
Well, I don't know. I haven't thought about that. There are certainly materials that are off-putting to dogs that often are not off-putting to us, right? So that's things underfoot, and anybody who has an older dog knows that there's slippery things, right? And they're things that are more or less comfortable underfoot. They're very sensitive to smells. So a lot of the things which we use as cleansers and cleaning products, and we put on them, they are averse to, right? If you've ever shampooed your dog and the dog goes straight for the dirt pile and rolls around in it, guess what? Is that they don't like that smell on them, covering their smell. So there probably are all sorts of materials and smells which I would avoid. They are pretty flexible, so you can put them in lots of types of spaces. It's not just an architectural solution, though. It's a solution of, can there be a society, can there be social life for that dog? They're a social species, and they have to have the opportunity. There would be a way that the dogs could interact with each other, I suppose, right? Have the option to, visit the guy down the hall. Right? And
that's
come out,
interesting.
Sniff their little holes, where they could put their noses out the front door and sniff who's coming by, and there would be just opportunities to be with others, which is what dogs want to be.
Howard.
And then I'd like to add, so Pete Garcia is here again, and he's helping do this 13th Street sort of revitalization. I don't think 13th Street was ever vital, so I don't know what the right word is. But we're so car-oriented, and like children and ourselves, we're pushed to the side, we're pushed to this margin between the building and the curb, and we have all this space for the cars. But then the dogs are actually, peeing on the trees and killing the street trees. The part of the reason is the dogs have no place to go.
Yeah.
And so when you come right out of these apartments, as in droves, there's thousands of people with dogs walking up and down the street. 13th Street could become something that has less car orientation and more space orientation for walking dogs and dog living, because you're along a corridor. 14th Street, which is right here, is going to be a pedestrian-only street. But we're not thinking in terms of space, natural space, and things like for dogs, which are such a big part of the reason why we'd even close down a street. The reason why we'd even have bigger sidewalks is to take our dogs and promenade from one place to another. So it's a very good point you're making.
Yeah.
You bring up something else which I've always thought is a huge unsolved urban problem, which is elimination, right? And there have been attempts. So there's a book, I think the guy's name is Brandis, who wrote a book about the poop scoop law in New York. And it's a whole book about this, because there is a whole book worth of stories about when people suddenly said, I'm fed up with there being piles of poop everywhere, and we've got to have a law about this, but owners won't pick it up. But then, of course, we all did, right? And we chase around our dogs with their precious bags of poop and so forth. But it's still weird that we don't have a solution for a sewage solution for all the dog waste. And so of course the dogs use the trees or the lampposts, because that's where the last dog did. And it's a bulletin board with lots of information about who's been by, and they want to check it out, and it's interesting for them. As an owner, I'm not going to stop my dog from sniffing that tree, because that's like good information about who's been there, right? And who's been by. So that's we could really use some creative thought there with how do you create a landscape which doesn't devastate the landscape with all this this animal waste, right?
And I've definitely wondered about that as it relates to, I live on the west side of LA in Santa Monica, and I guess in Santa Monica they're really keen on saving water. So to save water, they've, in some of the sidewalks where there was grass, they've now put in the fake turf. And all the dogs pee and poop on the fake turf, and it really smells. Like, it smells much more than when it was grass or sort of dust, sand. And so is that a good solution? I'm not sure. What do you think? Because it's made it pretty smelly.
Like, do you like using outhouses? I don't love lit, but dog. I feel like it's sort of the communal outhouse for the dogs, and in some ways it could be off-putting, and but in some ways it could attract more dogs to the site. But I think that's the type of thing. I mean, that would need to be created as kind of communal spaces which could be flushed, essentially, right?
Right, because currently we do seem to be going in slightly after the fact with the dog design. It's definitely, we want the dogs, definitely. Sorry, Howard.
Well, I was just going to say, so one of the biggest issues we have in downtown are bathrooms. Now, if you really want great shopping, if you really want people to spend time and spend money, you need to give them a place to go to the bathroom. And we hold that for homelessness issues. We're trying to keep from supplying homeless, and we're doing this sort of the same thing with these dog areas. And then I know, Justin, you have a very elaborate sort of thing going on, don't you? Here.
Let me preface by it's a social experiment, this location, but yeah, when we made the new space, this dog run it's called a dog run, not a dog park, by the way. It's actually half the size of square footage of the one that we had in the past. It's closer to everybody. I mean, it gets windy. It's close to our food. We actually went through probably 4 different, we're talking scientists, R&D companies. Right now we're using a chlorine dioxide solution that it's basically, if you're a swimmer in the summer, it's like you go in the pool all the time. Totally safe to people and dogs, but it can also change the color of dogs' fur, which we just learned right now. And I mean, that's honestly, this has been the only solvent that has been close to helping it's actually the urine smell. And we have to use it, or else the space it will become uninhabitable. And even explaining that, I was telling you, Francis, about the signs, putting up signs into the dog park. There's a new sign going up every month now about how I feel like it's an improvement, obviously, because you don't want to smell that, but the influx of dogs is in the hundreds, per week. So we clean it twice a day, and then also flush it out of the bottom. When we built it out, we didn't put concrete underneath it. We put about a foot and a half of actually like gravel and sand. So I mean, like I said, it was an experiment. And we're getting there, but it's still not like as pleasant as possible.
But it's definitely proving that people want dogs and want the dogs to go somewhere, which takes me to the more human-centered issue. You said, your cortisol levels go down when you pet the dog. I mean, the dogs bring us such joy. As I mentioned, there's many people that live in environments where they're not allowed to have a dog. In LA, it's something like 40% of landlords actually don't allow people to have dogs. There's certain neighborhoods that tend more favorably to dogs than others. There's some that don't allow dogs. There's barely any landlord that allows a dog. As we are generally moving away from the suburban model, we are tending to move to more dense environments. Is it incumbent on elected officials, on planners, to really kind of make it, to mandate landlords to allow dogs? Because dogs are our families. For some of us, they are our only family if we're living on our own. Is that fair to humans to not allow them the presence of a dog?
I mean, I think that's tough, because you have all sorts of people who don't want to live with dogs too, right? I mean, and that's their right. As long as dogs are property, which, as Justin said, they legally are considered property, because of the law, everything is persons or property, so they're not persons. So they're the other side. Then we have the right to own them or not own them, and we also have the right to not be impinged upon by them. And there are plenty of people who don't want to be impinged upon, and if you're a landlord and you have a right to do with your property as you like. So I get that. Now, I would say maybe dogs shouldn't be property, right? Maybe their being family members means that idea, that legal idea, is antiquated. And if they become somehow legal property or self-owned or some other kind of status, then just like this extension of therapy dogs and service dogs into public spaces where they wouldn't necessarily have been allowed at some point, maybe pet dogs would also be. And there is all sorts of therapeutic effect of just an untrained pet dog with their person. So I think it would have to come from that legal position as opposed to saying, because we are a rights-based culture. We don't want to give up our rights to do what we want with our property. So I think people still have a right to have or not have a dog on their property. But the tendency of our society is to say, but they're not just property. And that's where I think it could change.
And the tendency of our cities right now, at least in LA and some other cities, is there's far less single-family homes being built at an affordable price for a family or a single person. So really the only option in some of these West Coast cities is to rent an apartment. There isn't another option. So what do you do? Again, I guess I'm going back to the same point, which is if the only living option is a rental apartment, should it be up to the landlord
right.
to
well,
determine?
If the law reified their status, their kind of perceived status as children in our lives, right? Which I think some people do consider their dogs their children, whether they have children or not, human children or not. If the law reified that, then yes, then they would have to, right? But I think it has to come from the position of the law before you can force a landlord to do something.
Okay, so you've brought up children. That's very interesting. So say a dog were, I guess, legally seen as a child, would then that child have to go to school? Because one of the issues pertaining to the landlords that don't want the dogs is that dogs, can get into can I guess be an annoyance. So they bark through the night. I've definitely known people who've gone to the mat fighting to get the neighbor out that has the dog that barks too much and annoys them. So in this future world where perhaps a dog becomes a child, does it then also have the obligations of a child?
Well, I think the child is an interesting analog, but it's not the only analog. They wouldn't become actual children. They wouldn't become persons. Although there are people who are arguing, like Stephen Weiss in the Non-Human Rights Project is arguing that non-human animals like chimpanzees or elephants should be considered persons under the law with types of rights. Children are interesting status because we don't own them, but we are responsible for them in certain kinds of ways, right? They are persons, but they don't have abilities to do things themselves. So there's an interesting analog there, but dogs aren't going to develop into adults, so it falls apart a little bit. It's also like the analogy with wild animals, right? We have some responsibility as a society to take care of wild animals, but we don't own them. Exactly. We are responsible at some level to maintain their environment of endangered animals and to ensure their well-being. They're not exactly, property isn't quite the right word for them, right? So there's some maybe middle status that wild animals and dogs could potentially be in the future.
Do you think dogs living in cities are happier if they have a companion, like another dog? Is that a happier dog?
Depends on the dog, right?
Ah.
I mean, very much. I think social companionship is hugely important to dogs, but it could be either species, person or dog. And some dogs who've lived with a person are not interested in it. It should be up to the dog, frankly. When we had a dog, we got our second dog for our first dog, and the first dog chose the second dog. They met, and that's why we got the second dog when we were sure that they were going to get along, because we had some responsibility to the first one to make sure that he wanted to be with another one. Not all dogs would want. I mean, I guess if your kids got to choose whether they have a sibling or not, maybe they would choose no, or maybe they would choose yes.
So it depends, doesn't it? They go both ways.
Yeah. So either way, but it's very individual. Dogs are different. We're talking about dogs like a monolith, which is what I do in my science too. Like there's one type of dog, but of course there isn't. There are many kinds of dogs with all those personalities.
Right, Howard.
Well, I was just say it's funny how we've talked about children and cars in relationship to dogs.
Yeah.
It's a really, I hadn't thought of any of that.
Right. So Alexandra, before meeting you, I was looking up the cities that are the best place to live with your dog, and one of them was Boston. And Boston is a great city because you can take your dog to the bar. Do you think that's a kind of, or rather, what would you say were the best types of cities for a dog to live in?
Well, chances for social interaction. So ones where there's lots of open space is what I would say. That's the most likely place. being able to go with your person to places is quite good. So if that's the bar, if your person's going to the bar every day, then that's awesome if the dog can come with them, right? But also to work, these dog-friendly workspaces, which are popping up everywhere and are actually a little more popular in renovating or sort of rejuvenating cities than in cities like New York, which are a little entrenched and the spaces aren't accommodating of dogs. So those where you can bring your dogs with you, I think that is a positive for most dogs during the day, yeah.
But the workspace, actually, that really is an interesting one because, yes, it's true, more and more people are able to bring their dog to work. But actually, that can be a little bit invasive for colleagues, It's like when there's a bring your child to work day, not everybody wants to have a child running around. So that's pretty interesting, that one.
Or a car.
Or bring your
Bringing it
car
around.
to work.
leave the car in the parking garage. But what do you think about this notion of
but
sort
just
of bringing
like
your
the
dog to work?
parks, right? It's something that usually gets worked out within the community,
Right, but the
So-
dog park is all people with dogs. The
That's right.
workspace is not necessarily all dog lovers.
But dog people and non-dog people, they still have conversations, as far as I understand. They still work it out in the same way, right? Dogs who are too rambunctious for workspaces, then that looks like they're not going to work out. And often private companies which bring dogs in allow them. They have very specific rules. If your dog gets in a scuffle with another dog, then there are 3 strikes or something like that, and then you can't bring them back. And so it's only the dogs who are quiescent and are enjoying themselves and are calm who wind up coming to those spaces.
Reading your book, I see that you've discovered that dogs, were featured in people's lives, definitely dating back to the time of Pompeii and Vesuvius.
Oh, sure.
And you've also mentioned cities over time that did seem not to allow dogs, like Reykjavik, Iceland. I saw
Right.
that you mentioned. Now, there's other cities that are pretty friendly to dogs, like say Paris, which is famous one for its like great pooper scooper crazy contraptions, but also well-dressed ladies with their well-dressed dogs, being fed in the restaurant together, caring more for the dog than for the children that they ignore. Which is your sort of favorite dog city?
Well, I mean, Paris is wonderful for having off-leash. And it's changed somewhat, but for having off-leash dogs where there's like an expectation of the dog that they're going to be following you down the street, right? We've done something weird in leashing all our dogs. It creates this funny tension between the person and the dog. It also creates this perceived idea of control, but you really don't control your dog through the leash, you sort of frustrate them through the leash, and you frustrate yourself because you can't get the dog to do what they want by doing this behavior. This is not like a good communication behavior. And yet, so we've like pretended that that's the way we have control of our dogs, whereas if you have a city where a lot of dogs are off leash, you have to have a relationship with your dog where they come when you need them to come, and they have to have some city sense where they know not to walk into the street when there's a car and so forth. So I enjoy that when I see it successfully done. Yeah.
So interesting. Thank you so much, Alexandra, Howard. Thank you all.